Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today, and I wanted to talk about my new WR250R and basically give a 1,000 kilometer, although it's a little bit more than that now, review of first impressions of the bike going from 0 kilometers up to 1,000, what's changed, general impressions of the bike itself, and really my thoughts going forward. So to start off with, obviously, these bikes only weigh about 130 kilos, which on the road side of things is very, very light. And I've got to say, riding these on the road can be a lot of fun. It's a very revvy single cylinder. It's got nice power. It's got a bit of torque to it. It's a very easy power plant to make use of. I do have to say, I think the gearing on the stock bike could probably do with a little bit of adjustment, because I often feel like I'm just kind of in between where I want to be on one gear and the next gear. I might try and lower the gearing to get that a little bit better, and I'll obviously have to rev it a little bit more, but I think there's enough performance there in the engine to do that with no issues whatsoever. Obviously, with the narrow wheels and the overall geometry of the bike, it's a very sharp handler. It's very easy to get through traffic. It's something that actually, even through the nice twisties, I find myself having to make sure that I don't do what I do on a normal road bike, where I really break into the corners and push it through, because with this, the handling is so sharp that it means that I'm really going way too hard into those corners, and then I have to kind of let my lines open back up a little bit more. I want to get some stickier tires on it, because when I had the D606s on it, I felt like the extra level of grip and I think a different profile on the tire actually made doing the twisties a little bit more fun, and the off-road performance was good as well. These are the Trailwing 302s, kind of an all-round tire, but I'm not a huge fan of the profile of the tire, particularly as you lean the bike over. And I wasn't a huge fan either of the wet weather performance. There are a couple of times I just didn't feel like it had the best feel, where on the D606s, in the past, I've been really, really happy with those. So I might swap them over once I get a little bit more wear on these to see how that changes things. As far as the brakes, you've obviously got a reasonably simple braking system. A lot of your braking performance is that rear brake, which is unsurprising. It's got the single disc on the front, nothing really to write home about. However, I guess I'd say that combined with the suspension setup on the stock bike works well together. For general riding, I don't find I get too much dive into the forks when I'm hard on the brakes. However, the one thing I will say is when I'm coming to a stop and I'm braking a little bit harder, that's when I get some dive. So if I'm riding through the twisties or something like that, it's quite well supported. Putting the brakes on to, wash off some speed coming into corners and things like that, or even trailing the brakes into the corners, it's very well balanced, nice, easy thing to ride. However, I find when I'm coming to a stop on the road, that's where I get the more dive in the front forks. And I wouldn't mind a little bit more support in those situations where I'm coming to a stop and I don't get as much dive. The rear, I don't have any problems with at all. Obviously, the WR250R suspension is a stronger point on this particular bike, which is why it's a more expensive machine. And I'm very much keen to get the most out of the stock suspension and adjust it to my weight and my needs before I look at upgrading it, but I probably will be upgrading it in the future. So, nicely balanced bike, good brakes. My one complaint about the brakes on this bike is that the rear brake lever, I have had to adjust it right down, and I still don't have it low enough that I can really easily use it. I've kind of got to lift my foot, which annoys me. Luckily in my City Adventure 2 boots, they're a very flexible boot, so getting the foot up isn't an issue there, but I want it so that I can just move my foot across and use the brake really naturally. The same goes when standing up, because a lot of the braking performance is on the rear of this bike, which you're going to be using for control. Off-road, it's hard to fault the WR250R, although again, this is from someone new to off-road riding and with pretty basic skills. The bike is light, it's easy to pick up, and above all, ultra manageable. The suspension swallows up the larger divots easily, although picking your line to avoid them where possible is the way to go, and the bike will just tractor over practically anything it's presented with. You can just rev that little single like crazy, and as long as you're not seriously mischoosing your gears, you'll be good. Gear shifts are also easy up without clutch and down with minimal clutch. Aggressive downshifting is also smooth on the road with pretty wide gear ratios, although obviously it's possible to skid the rear given enough speed differential. Brakes aren't overly powerful on the road, but ideal for me without loading the bike up on the dirt, where traction is the big limitation, especially on those standard tyres. Quickly returning to the engine on the WR250R, when I first picked up the bike and for the first 300 Ks or so, I did feel like the engine was a little bit more restrained than I remembered the last time I tested one of these bikes, which obviously was a bike which had a lot more kilometers on it and had been set up by somebody. Now, jumping on the bike, my first impression was, I don't feel like the performance quite at the level it was at when I last rode one of these. However, 1,000 kilometers later, the engine has loosened up a little bit, and the power, the way it's delivered and the way it's generated and things, has certainly just basically loosened up, and I remember it much more like it is now. So while jumping on the bike straight off, I think I was feeling a little bit, I'm not going to say disappointed, but I didn't feel like it quite aligned with the last time I rode one of these. Now, after 1,000 kilometers, that's much more the case. And I have not done any modifications as far as performance on this bike. Whether disconnecting the X-up might make it breathe a little bit more freely and run a little bit more freely is something that I'm going to look into. One thing that I notice a lot of people seem to say is the simple fact that that actually reduces the amount of heat generated by the bike, because it's not all getting bottled up behind that valve at low RPM. But you do rev this bike really hard, so generally speaking, for your general riding, you're quite quickly getting to the point where that valve is opening up in the exhaust and it's flowing a lot more freely. One thing to keep in mind with these bikes is they have a very tall seat height. 930 mils, I think it is, on the stock bike, the stock seat. And if you're on the shorter side of things, that may be somewhat of an issue. It's a very light bike, it's very manageable, and I'll just show you jumping on now. So for me, in my City Adventure 2 boots, which have a bit more of a sole on them, I can get both feet down almost flat. I think this surface isn't the flattest. Normally on the road, if it's a flat surface, I can get both feet down flat and it's pretty much perfect. One of the things I do notice as far as that seat height is when you're on board, obviously the suspension sags a little and the reach to the ground becomes more manageable. If you're putting one foot down, which I find is easier to do on the right side, it's an easier reach to the ground. On the left side, getting 1 foot down, also easy, but it feels like it's a little bit more of a stretch to the left. Keeping in mind that if you get off the bike, you're actually going to find that seat height rises because there's not enough weight on the bike to get that suspension sagging and kind of settling. And that does make it easy to get one leg down because obviously you've got your weight off the bike like this. No problems at all because it's a narrow seat. You can move across on it and move around on it very, very easily. However, at the end of the day, it's a tall seat height and certainly one of the tallest in the category. So you really can't get around that. You do need to make sure that you're comfortable with that. There is a lowering link available. There's a lower seat height option through Seat Concepts. I've got the stock seat on today to demonstrate how the bike is stock, but I've got the taller Seat Concept seat for if I'm doing really long days, like if I'm doing 500 or 1,000 kilometers in a day. Obviously, if you're going down trails, it's less of an issue because you're standing up on the bike and that affects, essentially speaking, the amount of time you're spending sitting on that seat. The seat is narrow, it's very easy to grab between your knees. In that regard, everything that I'd want. However, for the longer kilometers, the seat is quite soft and I do sink into it a bit and it gets uncomfortable after, 45 minutes or even half an hour. Not enough that I'd have to stop riding, but something like the Seat Concepts option certainly helps there. So what else is there to mention? The bike is quite simple. Obviously, the greater premium you pay over things like the old CRF 250 and even the KLX 250 is largely in the suspension and of course in the high performance engine. But at the end of the day, this is a simple machine, particularly for someone coming from a road background. You've got a very simple dash, there's no tacho, it's got a trip meter, it's got a clock, everything that you'd probably need for the basics, but basic clutch, basic brake. You don't get any standard protection on the bike for those levers. I've added bark busters. Likewise, adding a sump guard is important if you're doing some more adventure style riding, just to stop rocks and things from damaging or potentially damaging the engine if they get flicked up. The bars I'd heard are quite soft, and I kind of scoffed at that. I kind of went, oh, for my kind of riding, I'll be all right. No, they are quite soft. I've already bent these. Obviously, I did really do a number on the bike on my first big adventure ride. There's this screen which I've added, but obviously not a lot of wind protection. Simple indicators, no LEDs or anything like that. Obviously that's something I probably will change in the near future just to make it look a little bit cooler, but certainly not a priority. What I would say was the priority is replacing those pegs. The standard pegs are quite narrow, and while riding on the road, doing commuting and stuff like that, don't really notice whatsoever. Once I got out onto the trails and I was standing up on the bike, they were just too narrow for me. I do have a larger foot, but I couldn't get comfortable and I couldn't get balanced on those pegs. Putting those Zeta wider pegs on has made quite a difference there, and I'm really happy to have put those on. My one only other complaint really is the fuel tank size. Now, it's a 7.8 litre fuel tank. This morning when I filled up, I had done 105 kilometres and I put 3.5 litres in. So the mileage you get and the efficiency of the engine is really, really good, and I've got to say, I was riding pretty hard. You know, this is wide open throttle most of the time, really having a go on the bike. So I think that's a fairly typical level of fuel consumption. However, it's only an 8 litre or 7.8 litre tank, so your range is about 200 kilometres, maybe with a little bit of room to spare. Ideally, I'd like that to be up around the 300 kilometre range, because that's an easier kind of scenario to fill up the bike, and it means that you're not constantly looking for fuel stops. I've got the rack on the back. I was thinking about sticking on an extra fuel tank there. At the moment, there's not a lot available, and I'm also looking at getting a larger tank. I think the larger tank is probably going to be the more ideal option, just so I can get a little bit more range and so I can spend the day out exploring and not worrying about fuel. But that'll be a future video. So all up, 1,000 kilometers later, very, very happy with my purchase. I'm interested to see what I'm thinking at, say, 6,000 and 12,000 kilometers. As I do more to the bike, spend more time on it, I'm still getting used to the handling on the road, because I know you can push these things really, really hard. The thing is, I still want a different set of tires on it to do that. Not to say there's anything particularly wrong with these tires. They're just not my kind of preference of what I'm looking for as far as feel, profile. Probably largely profile, and I wouldn't mind something a little bit stickier as far as the kind of level of feedback I'm getting. But really, really great machine. I definitely recommend, if you're interested in one of these WR250Rs and you want to buy one new, definitely see if they're still available in your region of the world, because in most places they aren't. They're getting phased out pretty quickly, unfortunately, and it might be your last chance to buy one new. There are more on the second-hand market compared to even 6 months ago, where there was basically none. But I'm happy buying one new, because like I said in my previous video, I really wanted to make this a project bike where I did everything, I fitted all the accessories, and very much made it my own. So thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, leave a comment if you've got any questions. As always, stay safe out there, and thanks for watching.